You know, as a philosopher, I bet you're always digging into the big ideas, right? Like, what even is something? What's it all about? What does it mean? These super fundamental
Yeah,
questions.
definitely.
You break them down, turn them over, think about them from every angle.
That's the fun part.
Right. But have you ever tried applying that to music? It seems so straightforward at first, right? Music, it's just there, part of life. But when you actually try to grab hold of it intellectually to define it, well,
Yeah.
it gets slippery, doesn't it?
It really does. And that's what makes it so fascinating from a philosophical perspective, wouldn't you say?
Totally. It's this everyday thing that suddenly throws up all these philosophical roadblocks.
Right. You start asking what seems like a simple question, and you end up down this rabbit hole of complex theories and debates.
And that's exactly the rabbit hole we're going to jump into today.
Let's do it.
So, for this deep dive, we're using the Philosophy of Music entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, that's a good one.
Really insightful stuff. It's got this really sharp analytical approach, which, as philosophers, I think we'll both appreciate.
Absolutely. Cuts right to the chase. No beating around the bush.
Definitely. So, no musical fluff today. We're going deep, folks,
Ah.
deep into the philosophical thick of it. We're going to try to answer some pretty fundamental questions like, what even is music?
How do we even tell?
Exactly. And then, what about a musical work? Is it the score, the performance, something else altogether? It gets kind of mind-bendy.
Oh, yeah, there are a lot of different theories on that one. We'll have to unpack those for sure.
We will. And then, of course, there's this whole mystery about music and emotion. How can something so abstract, without words or pictures, really get us in the
Well,
feels?
it's like, how does that even work?
Yeah. It's pretty amazing when you stop to think about it. So much philosophical ground to cover. Okay, so let's start with trying to define music. Like a philosopher would, the first thing you come across is this idea of music as organized sound.
Yeah, that's the classic starting point, right?
Yeah, it seems to make sense. But then you think about it. My neighbor mowing his lawn, that's organized sound. A car alarm, also organized. But are those music? Not so much, right?
Definitely not. So that basic definition, organized sound, it's clearly missing something.
Yeah, it needs some serious refining. And that's where the philosophical heavy lifting comes in. Our trusty Stanford entry takes us through a bunch of different theories that try to pin down what those missing ingredients might be.
Right. And a lot of them focus on coming up with necessary conditions for something to count as music.
Okay, necessary conditions, meaning if something doesn't have these qualities, then it can't be music.
Precisely. So one big camp focuses on, let's call them inherent musical properties, the sounds
Okay,
themselves.
so like pitch, rhythm, maybe timbre, the actual building blocks of music.
Exactly. Thinkers like Roger Scruton, Andy Hamilton, Andrew Kania, they've all explored this approach.
So the definition of music would rest on the structure of the sounds themselves, the way they relate to each other.
You got it. But here's the snag. Composers have shown us that practically any sound can become musical.
True. Like an orchestra using weird percussion instruments.
Right. Or think about Leroy Anderson. He wrote a piece that uses a typewriter as an instrument. And then you have Yoko Ono with her toilet piece.
Oh yeah, Yoko Ono, always pushing the boundaries.
Exactly. So if almost anything can be incorporated into music, then it gets super tricky to define music by a strict set of sonic features.
Okay, I see the problem there. If almost anything goes, then how do you draw the line? So what's the other main way philosophers try to define music?
This one shifts the focus to the experience of music, how it makes us feel, the aesthetic judgments we make.
So it's less about what it is and more about what it does to us.
Right. It's about the aesthetic qualities we perceive or how we engage with music differently than, say, other sounds.
I can see where that's coming from, but how does that handle something like poetry? It uses sound in an organized, often beautiful way,
Yeah.
but we call it literature, not music.
Exactly. That's a major challenge for this approach. Levinson specifically tried to exclude language-based sounds from his definition of music.
But then, doesn't that create a new problem? Where's the clear boundary between, say, music and poetry, or music and sound art, for that matter?
It's tough.
Hmm,
Hamilton tries to solve this by proposing three separate categories: music, poetry, and sound art.
a three-way split. Hmm. I'm not sure that completely solves it, though. It feels like there's still some overlap and blurriness between those categories.
True. And by focusing so much on aesthetic experience, Hamilton might accidentally exclude stuff we think is music, like scales or background music that might not be aiming for some profound aesthetic experience.
Okay, so it seems like we're in a bit of a bind here. Trying to define music either lets in things we don't consider music or leaves out things we do.
It's a real philosophical head-scratcher. But Andrew Catania offers an interesting twist. He suggests that maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe music isn't necessarily an art form at all.
Wait, music not an art form? That's a bold claim.
I know, right? But hear him out. He says we should separate the medium of music, which he defines as organized sound, from its artistic uses.
Okay, I'm following. So organized sound could be used for art, like in a symphony, but also for other things that aren't art.
Exactly. He compares it to language. We use language to create literature, which is art. But language itself isn't defined solely by its artistic uses. We also use it for everyday communication.
That's a helpful analogy. So a car alarm, for example, uses organized sound, but its purpose isn't artistic.
Right, it's about function, not aesthetics. But now comes Jonathan McCune Green with another challenge. He's worried about definitions that are too stuck in our current understanding of music.
Like, what we consider music now might be totally different from what people consider music in 100 years.
Exactly. He calls this the future-proof problem. He's concerned that definitions based on our current conception of music might end up being just a snapshot of a particular moment in history.
So it's like they're describing musical trends, not eternal truths.
Right. He specifically criticizes Kanye's and Levinson's attempts to define music by necessary and sufficient conditions. He argues that maybe they're just describing a certain period in music history rather than giving us a truly timeless definition.
That's a crucial point for any philosophical definition. If it can't stand the test of time, what good is it?
Right. But interestingly, Kanye pushes back and says McCune Green's critique could apply to pretty much any definition of music, not just his.
So maybe it's an inherent problem with trying to pin down something as fluid and evolving as music?
Maybe. Now, there's one more element we need to throw into the mix. Silence. It feels so integral to music, right? The pauses, the rests, the spaces between the notes.
Yeah, silence is like the breath between the words. It shapes the sound.
Right. But it also seems kind of paradoxical. How can the absence of sound be a part of music?
It's a good question, and our source tackles it head on.
So you have rests in traditional music, those intentional silences written into the score. Some even say listeners actively pay attention to those silences.
Like they're listening to the not sound.
Yeah. But then there's John Cage's 4 33 Arrow, which takes this idea to the extreme.
Oh yeah, the famous silent piece. 4 minutes and 33 seconds of... What exactly?
Well, the most common interpretation is that the music is the ambient sounds that happen during the performance. Coughs, chairs creaking, traffic outside.
So it's less about no sound and more about bringing attention to the sounds we usually ignore.
Exactly. Although Julian Dodd actually disagrees with that interpretation, so even that's up for debate.
Oh, of course it is. Philosophers got to disagree about something, right?
Always. But the bigger question is 4 3 Arrow actually music? Stephen Davies and Julian Dodd say no. They argue that those random sounds aren't organized as music, so it doesn't count.
So intentionality matters.
Seems like it. And Cancania argues that it fails his tonality condition, so it can't be music according to his definition. But Douglas Waddell says that because it relates to existing musical practices and traditions, it can be considered music.
Okay, so it's about context, too. How the piece fits into the broader world of music.
Yeah. And to make things even more complicated, Canella points to another piece, Erwin Schulhoff's In Futurum.
In Futurum? What's that one about?
It's actually a piece made entirely of rests. No sounds at all, just silence is written into the score.
Wow, so an actual silent piece, and this was written before 433 or?
Yep, predates it. So Canella uses this to argue that maybe there can be genuinely silent music, so even silence itself isn't straightforward when it comes to defining music.
It's like music is this philosophical chameleon. It keeps changing colors on you.
Right. Every definition you try to pin on it, it seems to slip away.
Okay, so we've been wrestling with what music is. Let's now shift gears and think about what a musical work is. This is where we get into musical ontology.
Now we're getting metaphysical.
Right. We're philosophers, so of course we got to talk about being. And for music, this gets especially interesting because you have so many layers. You have the score, the composer's intentions, then all the different ways a piece can be performed.
And each performance is unique in some way, right? So what's the real work? Is it just an abstract idea? Or is it somehow contained in each performance?
So many questions. Our Stanford source calls this the fundamentalist debate.
Catchy title.
It is. And it mainly focuses on Western classical music, which makes sense because that tradition has such a strong emphasis on notation and performance.
Yeah, it's all about writing it down and then playing it for an audience.
Right. So this creates all sorts of interesting puzzles for philosophers to try and solve.
Basically, it boils down to this. Are musical works real things that exist, or are they just, I don't know, illusions, ideas in our heads?
So realists versus anti-realists.
Exactly. And realists have been the dominant group historically. But even among realists, there are a bunch of different camps. The entry starts by outlining some of the less common, more out there views.
Like what? Give me the weird stuff.
Okay, well, there's idealism. Thinkers like Collingwood and Sartre, they argue that musical works are actually mental things, like objects in our imaginations, or maybe shared subjective experiences.
So the music only exists in our minds. That's kind of trippy.
Yeah. But it has some problems. Like, if a musical work is just my personal mental image, how can I share it with you? How do we know we're thinking about the same thing?
That's a good point. It seems like communication would break down pretty quickly.
Right. And it also seems to ignore the importance of the actual sounds, the physical reality of the music.
Yeah, it's not just a thought experiment. It's vibrations in the air hitting our eardrums.
Exactly. Though, to be fair, some philosophers are trying to revive these idealist theories in new ways.
Always got to keep those debates going.
Yeah.
So what's another unorthodox take on musical ontology?
That would be action theory.
Hmm.
David Davies is the big name here. He says musical works, along with all other art, are actually actions. Specifically, the actions of the composer when they create the piece.
So it's not about the score or the performance, but about the act of composing itself.
Yep. Gregory Curry has a similar idea, saying that artworks are actually types of actions.
But that seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like, I think of a performance as being the realization of the work, not just the composer sitting at their desk writing notes.
Yeah, it definitely goes against how most people think about it. To convince people, action theorists need to come up with some pretty strong arguments.
Okay, so we've covered some of the more fringe theories. What about the mainstream views on musical ontology?
The big ones are Platonism and nominalism. Platonism is probably the most popular view. It says that musical works are abstract objects, like mathematical concepts or moral values.
So they exist outside of space and time? Like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony exists as an idea, even if no one's playing it?
Exactly. And that fits our intuition that a musical work is a thing, not just a collection of performances.
Yeah, it makes sense. But then what even are abstract objects? That's a whole other philosophical can of worms.
Oh yeah, Platonism has its own problems to deal with. But within Platonism, there are two main flavors.
Hit me with the flavors.
First, there's simple Platonism. This is the view that musical works are eternal. They've always existed and always will. Thinkers like Peter Kivy and Julian Dodd are in this camp.
Okay, so timeless, unchanging musical essences floating around in the realm of the abstract.
Pretty much. But then there's complex Platonism. This view says that while musical works are abstract, they still come into being through human actions, specifically through the composer's act of creation.
Okay, so they're not eternal, they have a beginning.
Right. And they have properties that are attributed to them, like being in a certain key or having a particular tempo.
So it's like the composer brings this abstract entity into existence through their creative act.
Exactly. Philosophers like Ingarden, Thomason, Wolterstorff, Levinson, Stephen Davies, they've all contributed to this more nuanced version of Platonism.
Okay, so that's Platonism. What about nominalism? What's their take on musical works?
Nominalists want to ground musical works in something more concrete, something we can experience. They usually say a musical work is just the collection of all its performances.
So it's not a single thing, but a bunch of individual events.
Right, like the work is the sum total of every time it's been played, plus every time it could be played.
That's an interesting way to think about it. But wouldn't that mean that every mistake a musician makes becomes part of the work?
Yeah, that's a big problem for nominalism. It's called the problem of incorrect notes.
So if a violinist accidentally plays a wrong note, does that become part of Beethoven's Fifth? Doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah, it doesn't really fit with our intuition. So nominalists try to get around this by bringing in something called a provenential item.
Provenential. Sounds fancy.
It basically means something that gives the work its authority or authenticity. Usually it's the score or maybe the composer's act of composition.
So it's like there's a blueprint, even if the actual performances aren't always perfect copies.
Yeah, but then the question becomes, doesn't that blueprint start to sound a lot like an abstract object again? And if so, isn't nominalism collapsing back into some form of Platonism?
It's a sticky wicket for sure. So those are the realists. What about the folks who say musical works don't exist at all?
Ah, the anti-realists. They're a feisty bunch. We have two main types here, eliminativists and fictionalists.
Okay, break it down for me.
Eliminativists are like, look, this whole idea of musical works is just confusing. Let's just stop talking about them. Richard Rudner and Ross Cameron are examples here, though Cameron's view is specific to philosophical language. He's not saying we should stop talking about music in everyday conversation.
So it's like a philosophical house cleaning, getting rid of unnecessary concepts.
Yep. Then there are the fictionalists. They're a bit more chill. Andrew Kanya is the main proponent here. He says, okay, maybe musical works don't really exist, but we can still talk about them like they do. It's all a kind of make-believe, like talking about fictional characters in a book.
So it's a useful fiction.
Right. It allows us to have meaningful discussions about music without getting bogged down in metaphysical debates.
But doesn't that raise some problems too? Like, if it's all just pretend, does that diminish the value or importance of music?
Yeah, some philosophers argue that. They say fictionalism can't fully capture the power and impact that music has on our lives.
So it's another ongoing debate. No easy answers in the philosophy of music, it seems.
That's what keeps things interesting. And it's clear that these questions about musical ontology are tied to bigger questions about the nature of existence, the relationship between abstract and concrete.
Definitely. So we've covered defining music and then what a musical work is. What comes next in our philosophical journey?
Well, the Stanford entry goes on to tackle some more specific issues within musical ontology. One really interesting one is the question of authentic performance.
Ooh, authentic performance. This is something a lot of music lovers think about, I bet.
For sure. Like, what does it even mean for a performance to be authentic? And does authenticity make a performance better, more valuable?
Yeah, these are great questions. It's something I've definitely pondered at concerts.
Right. Like, are they playing it the right way?
Exactly. So how does philosophy approach this slippery concept of authenticity?
The entry points out that there are a couple of common misunderstandings about authenticity that we need to clear up first.
Leia, mommy.
First, authenticity isn't an all-or-nothing thing. It's not like a performance is either authentic or it's not. It's more about degrees of authenticity.
Okay, so there are different aspects to authenticity. A performance could be authentic in some ways, but not in others.
Exactly. Like, you could use instruments from the composer's time, but maybe take some liberties with the tempo.
So it's a spectrum, not a black and white issue. What's the second misunderstanding?
It's that authenticity doesn't automatically equal artistic value. A performance could be super historically accurate, authentic in every detail, but still not be a very good performance musically.
Oh, that's a really important point. Just because it's authentic doesn't mean it's going to be moving or enjoyable.
Right. You could have a technically flawless performance on period instruments that just leaves the audience cold.
Yeah, technique isn't everything. So how do philosophers try to define authenticity in relation to the musical work itself?
There are a few different camps. There are the pure sonicists, like Peter Kivy. They say a performance is authentic if it gets the notes and rhythms right. That's all that matters.
Okay, so if you're hitting the right notes in the right order, you're good.
Yep, according to them. Then there are the timbral sonicists, like Julian Dodd. They say, hold on, the timbres matter too.
Timbres. You mean the specific sound qualities of the instruments?
Right. They argue that an authentic performance needs to capture the sound world that the composer intended. So if the piece was written for a harpsichord, you shouldn't play it on a piano.
Makes sense. You want to get the sonic texture right, not just the notes.
Exactly. And then there are the instrumentalists, like Gerald Levinson. They're even stricter.
Stricter how?
They say you got to use the exact same types of instruments that the composer specified, like not just a harpsichord, but the specific type of harpsichord that was common in the composer's time.
Wow, so they're all about historical accuracy.
Totally. As you can imagine, this debate connects to bigger philosophical questions about art, like the tension between formalism and contextualism.
Okay, remind me about those again.
Formalists focus on the work itself, the notes and structure, while contextualists say you got to take into account the historical and artistic context.
So for authentic performance, a formalist might just care about playing the right notes, but a contextualist would want the whole historical package.
Exactly. Stephen Davies offers a contextualist view. He says musical works are kind of like recipes. Some have very specific ingredients, while others allow for more flexibility.
Okay, like a recipe that says use this specific type of apple versus one that just says any apple will do.
Perfect analogy. He suggests that older Western music might be more flexible in terms of instrumentation, while later music, like those massive romantic symphonies, require more specific instruments to get the sound right.
So authentic performance gets more complex the more specific the composer's instructions are.
It seems that way. But there's another wrinkle. Some argue that true authenticity is impossible because we're so far removed from the composer's time.
Yeah, we can't really know exactly how they heard it, what their intentions were.
Right. James Young talks about this. He points out all the challenges. Figuring out old notation, recreating old instruments, even understanding the musical tastes of a different era.
So even with the best intentions, we're always going to be missing some pieces of the puzzle.
It seems likely. But Stephen Davies counters that even if perfect sonic authenticity is impossible, we can still aim for partial authenticity.
Okay, so we can get closer, even if we can't perfectly recreate the past.
Right. He also says that being removed in time actually gives us a unique perspective. We can appreciate music from different eras and cultures in a way that people living in those times couldn't.
So our distance becomes an advantage.
Potentially. Young also raises the question of whether even a sonically perfect performance would allow us to hear the music like the original audience did. We have different musical backgrounds, different cultural assumptions.
Yeah, we're hearing it through modern ears.
Right. But Davies pushes back on that too. He says humans are pretty good at appreciating music from different contexts. We do it all the time.
True, we listen to music from all over the world, from all different periods of history.
Exactly. So while historical distance is a challenge, it doesn't completely rule out the possibility of meaningful, authentic performance. Now, Julian Dodd introduces an interesting idea. He says there might be more than one way to be true to a musical work.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
He says you can be faithful to the score, like playing all the notes exactly as written, but you can also be faithful to the music's overall expressive intent, its artistic spirit, even if that means deviating slightly from the written score.
So like capturing the emotional essence of the music, even if you have to bend the rules a bit.
Exactly. He calls this interpretive authenticity. And he says when these two types of authenticity conflict, interpretive authenticity should win.
So if the score says to play a certain way, but your gut tells you that doesn't quite capture the spirit of the music, you should trust your gut.
That's Dodd's position. But of course, there are counter-arguments.
Bring on the counter-argument.
Andrew Canania steps up here. He's not so convinced by Dodd's examples. He also worries that focusing too much on the overall point of the music could lead to neglecting the importance of small details.
So those tiny nuances in the score, the subtle phrasing choices, they all contribute to the meaning, even if we don't consciously notice them.
Right. Kanina argues that those details are how we come to understand the overall point in the first place.
Okay, so he's saying that respect for the score is still crucial, even when aiming for interpretive authenticity.
Precisely. He thinks the best way to show you understand the music is to play it carefully and accurately. That's the foundation for any meaningful interpretation.
It's like you gotta master the rules before you can break them effectively.
Yeah, great analogy. So even within this idea of authentic performance, there's a whole philosophical debate about what it means to be true to a musical work.
It's so fascinating how a seemingly simple question about performance opens up all these philosophical pathways. Now, our source also briefly touches on the ontology of other musical traditions, like rock and jazz. How do those genres complicate the questions we've been asking?
They really throw a wrench into things. Like for rock music, Theodore Graysick has made this pretty famous argument that the recording is actually the primary work.
Wait, so the recording is more important than the live performance?
That's what he says. He argues that when we listen to a rock song, we're usually listening to a recording, not a live band.
That's true. But doesn't that ignore the fact that most rock bands start by writing songs and playing them live?
Stephen Davies points that out. He says that rock is often fundamentally performance-based. The recordings come later.
Yeah, the energy of a live show, the interaction with the audience, that seems crucial to the rock experience.
Right. And this has led to other philosophers trying to modify Graysick's view, trying to incorporate elements of composition and live performance into the ontology of rock music.
So it's a dynamic conversation still evolving.
Absolutely. And then there's jazz, which throws a whole other curveball with its emphasis on improvisation.
Oh yeah, improvisation. That's got to be a headache for ontology.
It really is. Because if a jazz musician is improvising, creating the music in the moment, what does that mean for the work? Is there even a work in the traditional sense?
It's like the work is being created and recreated every time it's played.
Right, so some theorists say that in jazz, the performance is the work. There's no fixed entity beyond the individual act of improvisation.
So each performance is its own unique creation.
Exactly. Others argue that the work in jazz is actually a set of shared structures and conventions that the musicians use as a starting point for their improvisation.
Okay, so it's less about a fixed score and more about a framework for spontaneous creation.
Right, it's like a recipe where you're allowed, even encouraged, to add your own spices.
Love that analogy. But then, how do you even define the boundaries of the work? Where does one performance end and another begin?
It gets super blurry. But Julian Dodd offers an interesting perspective here. He says that jazz might actually be ontologically closer to early Western classical music.
Wait, really? Jazz and Bach, two sides of the same coin.
He argues that both traditions emphasize the performer's improvisational skills. Early classical music wasn't as strictly notated as it is today. Performers had more freedom to embellish and add their own flourishes.
So Dodd's saying that the improvisatory element doesn't negate the existence of a work, it just makes it more fluid and adaptable.
Exactly. He thinks we shouldn't conflate the question of what a jazz work is with questions about its aesthetic value or how we judge different performances.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like you can acknowledge the improvisational nature of jazz without throwing the whole concept of a musical work out the window.
Right. It's about recognizing the unique ontological challenges that different musical traditions present.
So much food for thought, right?
Mm.
It really is. Okay, let's shift gears again. We've talked about defining music and then the nature of a musical work. Now let's tackle another philosophical puzzle. Music and emotion. How does music make us feel things?
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. And it's something that everyone can relate to. We all have songs that make us happy, sad, angry, whatever.
Totally. It's part of the magic of music, right? But it's also a bit mysterious. How can these abstract sounds, without any words or pictures, evoke such powerful feelings?
Yeah, it's not like a movie that tells a story or a painting that shows you a scene. Music is more abstract, more, well, musical.
Right, and that's where the philosophical questions come in. Our trusty Stanford source breaks this topic down into two main areas. First, how does music express emotion? And second, how do listeners have emotional responses to music?
So first we got to figure out how emotion gets into the music. And then we got to understand what happens in our minds and bodies when we hear it.
Exactly. Two sides of the same emotional coin. And to keep things focused, the entry focuses on purely instrumental music, so no lyrics or anything like that.
Right, because we know that words can evoke emotions directly. The real challenge is to understand how music does it without language.
Okay, so no cheating with lyrics. So how do philosophers try to explain how purely instrumental music can be emotionally expressive?
Well, there's actually a group of philosophers called eliminativists who say it can't.
Wait, hold up. They're saying music can't express emotions.
That's their view. They try to explain away our talk about music being sad or happy as just metaphors.
Okay, so it's like when we say a piece of music is joyful, we don't really mean it's joyful. We're just using colorful language to talk about something else.
Right, they might say we're actually talking about the music's sonic qualities, its dynamics, its tempo, things like that.
So it's a description of the sound, not the emotion itself.
Exactly. But most people find this view pretty unconvincing. It just doesn't match up with our experience.
Yeah, when a piece of music makes me tear up, it feels like more than just a metaphor.
Right, there's a real emotional depth there. So eliminativism isn't a very popular view.
Makes sense. What's another theory?
There's conventionalism. This theory says that music's expressiveness comes from learned associations.
Okay, so it's like cultural conditioning. We learn that a certain type of music means a certain emotion.
Yeah, like a minor key often sounds sad to Western ears. But that's not because minor keys are inherently sad. It's because we've been taught to associate them with sadness.
So it's all about cultural context.
To some extent, yes. But conventionalism doesn't seem to explain all of music's emotional power.
Like there are pieces of music that just feel inherently joyful or melancholic, regardless of cultural background.
Exactly. And then there's this common idea that music is a language of emotions.
Oh yeah, I've heard that one. Music speaks to the soul.
It's a nice sentiment, but philosophically it runs into some problems. For one thing, music doesn't have the same kind of structure and grammar as language. It doesn't have words or sentences.
So it can't convey specific meanings in the same way that language can.
Right, and even if we grant that music can be about emotions in some way, that doesn't explain how it actually expresses them.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. So what about theories that try to connect music's expressiveness to real felt emotions.
There's the expression theory. This one says that music expresses the emotions of the composer or the performer.
So if a composer is feeling sad, they write sad music.
That's the idea. But it has a couple of big problems. First, composers don't always feel the emotions their music expresses.
Yeah, a composer could write a heartbreaking piece while they're feeling perfectly happy.
Exactly. And second, to express a certain emotion, a composer has to write music with particular characteristics. So that suggests that the expressive qualities are somehow already